Dungeons & Dragons, originally published in 1974 by TSR Hobbies, is without a doubt the most popular and beloved fantasy role-playing game of all time. Now, usually when the idea of what inspired D&D pops up, people point to The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, and that's not without good reason. Lord of the Rings is about larger-than-life heroes on an epic quest, and D&D also has larger-than-life heroes on an epic quest. Lord of the Rings has elves and dwarves and orcs in it, and D&D has all that stuff as well. But even though TSR co-founder Dave Arneson and several of his other tabletop wargaming friends were big fans of Tolkien's work, the other TSR co-founder, Gary Gygax, who wrote the majority of the rule sets for the original Dungeons & Dragons, was inspired by various other works by various other authors. Deep within the appendices of his Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide, Gygax included a long list of fantasy authors and their works that inspired him while he was coming up with the themes, setting, and rule sets of Dungeons & Dragons. This was called Appendix N. Now, seeing as I'm a big D&D fan and a big fan of the fantasy genre as well, I'd only be doing my due diligence if I checked out these older authors that aren't so well known nowadays and find out what made D&D tick. Find out what elements of their stories were inspirational on the development of Dungeons & Dragons and what makes the game so fascinating and so beloved today. So, on this inaugural episode of a new review series, I'll be looking at a book from Appendix N, without which I don't think D&D would be the same game that we know today. And that is Poul Anderson's 3 Hearts and 3 Lions. I'm Tim from Secret Fire Books, and welcome to Appendix N Adventures. Three Hearts and 3 Lions is a short fantasy novel by Poul Anderson, published in 1961, based off a novella of his that originally appeared in the pages of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction several years earlier. It follows a Danish-American soldier named Holger Karlsson, who during a battle in World War II is wounded, knocked unconscious, and wakes up not in a military hospital, but in the middle of an enchanted forest. Nearby, he finds a horse with some armor, some weapons, and deciding that he has stumbled into a dream, he suits up in the armor, straps on the weapons, gets up on the horse, and begins wandering around this newfound fantasy world in the guise of a knight-errant. Along the way, Holger befriends several magical creatures, including a wise old witch, a friendly dwarf, and a beautiful young woman who can transform herself into a swan. He soon finds that he is not actually dreaming. He has, in fact, somehow wandered into an alternate reality in which the various old-world European mythologies have meshed together and are in the middle of a conflict between, wait for it, the cosmic forces of order and chaos. Yes, our old friend Michael Moorcock was very much inspired by this book. Not only that, Holger also discovers that some of the various factions in play are trying to recruit him to their side, believing that this 20th century soldier turned paladin is somehow the key to winning the war. Now, in his struggle to find his way home, Holger has to decide who his real friends are, where his real loyalties lie, and most importantly of all, who he actually is. I debated myself about this for a while, but I'm finally starting to realize I really do not like this cover. In fact, I think I hate this cover. There are multiple editions of this book, and all of their covers are much better than this one. So, gonna have to get a new one soon. Don't worry about that. It's a paperback. They're virtually indestructible. Anyway, what did I like about this book? Well, it turns out quite a bit. But for now, let's talk about the sort of various mythological and fantasy elements that are at play in the story. This book has basically a little bit of everything. It's got elves and dwarves. It's got witches and wizards. It's got dragons and knights and castles. It's got werewolves and trolls and fish people. it's got a little bit of everything. It's this real hodgepodge, this real melting pot of various fantasy elements. There's even a little bit of history thrown in there too, some medieval history. And I think that even though it has all these disparate elements, and they could seem very cliched all thrown together. In fact, I think if you're a fan of modern fantasy, you might find this novel pretty cliche. But I think Poul Anderson handles it in such a way that it really does make a cohesive world. I feel like even though it has all these different elements, that they all feel like they blend together well enough. And the story that we tell with all these various tropes and elements from fairy tales and folklore and mythology, it goes toward making a very vibrant, very colorful, very enjoyable fantasy world to explore. And one of the big joys of this book is, turning the page and wondering, what kind of crazy fantasy scenario are our characters going to get into next time? What kind of characters, what kind of archetypes, what kind of, magical symbolism and fantasy trope am I going to recognize on the next page? It's a fantasy book that was written very much for fans of fantasy and mythology. Something that I was pleasantly surprised about when I first read this book, considering that it's so short, is that it's actually a pretty nice, in-depth character piece. The main character, Holger Karlsson, is this very typical fish-out-of-water kind of character. He does have this sort of macho man, meathead personality, but he does have some layers. There is a lot of depth to this character that gets explored over the course of the story, and mainly in the direction of what kind of person is he? What kind of man is he? Is he a hero or is he a villain? He's constantly struggling with the idea of, do I align myself with law? I'm told that I'm supposed to be this champion of law, this defender of the weak and the innocent. So do I align myself with law and stand up for the greater good? Or do I give into my selfish nature and I, go down in depravity and the chaos and just live for myself? That struggle is present with this character all throughout the course of the story. And sometimes you kind of like smack your head and go, dude, what are you doing? Why are you making this dumb decision? But in the end, he really does try to do the right thing. And he does try to rise above. And there are real elements of very strong heroism within this story featuring this character. I don't want to get too sociological on this video, but I don't think it's controversial in saying that the idea of selflessness is not something that's highly prioritized in our culture. We are constantly told from multiple different sources that you need to look out for yourself. You need to look out for number one. You do you. And that is not the moral question or the moral concept that is posed in this story. If it doesn't ask this question of the audience, it at least asks the question of the character. What kind of man are you? Are you a hero or a villain? Do you aspire to something greater, or are you willing to just give in to your human desires and do whatever you want? And I'm kind of a sucker for those kind of stories. I enjoy the kind of characters who, even though they're flawed, still try to do the right thing. They still try to be heroes. And I love characters who are selfless. I love Superman. I love Spider-Man. I love Aragorn from Lord of the Rings and Samwise and all these characters who they have so much going against them, and sometimes the things that they face, the greatest battles that they face, are their inner struggles. But in the end, they always choose to rise above. They always choose to be good people. They choose to be decent people and look out for their fellow man. So I'm a real sucker for those kind of stories, and that is very much the kind of thing that Poul Anderson imparts through the story in the form of Holger Karlsson. It's interesting to note that I've read an article that was actually in the introduction to my copy of Three Hearts and Three Lions. But Poul Anderson describes sort of his feelings toward writing this kind of fantasy, and he says that earlier in one of his older novels, The Broken Sword, which I will get around to reading eventually, it's on my list, in The Broken Sword, he was much more cynical, and it's very much a violent, grimdark kind of story, as opposed to Three Hearts and Three Lions, and he looks at this as him sort of maturing over the course of time, not just as a writer, but as a person. That as a young man, he was very cynical and very angry at the world, and so he wrote this very cynical, angry story. But when he got older, he decided to exemplify much higher ideals, much more moral, ethical ideals, and so he ended up writing this story that basically paints a character who, even though he's constantly tempted to give in to his inner demons, he still rises above that. I think it was kind of interesting to read that introduction and get the author's perspective on this kind of story. I know that there are some people, especially, people who like the grimdark stuff and the more modern style of fantasy, that won't enjoy these kind of sappy, positive stories. And the thing is, it's not all that positive a story. I don't want to spoil anything, but the book actually has a fairly bittersweet ending. But for the most part, it is this very wholesome, uplifting kind of story about real heroism and what real heroism can look like. So what didn't I like about this book? Well, we'll get the big one out of the way, I guess. Holger's a pervert. There's really no easy way of saying it. Holger is a pervert. He's very much a womanizer. He definitely believes himself to be a ladies' man. He tries to get with literally every single female character in this book, and he succeeds with quite a few of them. But where it gets really kind of squicky and uncomfortable is with the main female lead, Alianora. She is the Swan May. She is this magical shapeshifter who can turn into a swan thanks to her magical garment. And she's described as being very young and very naive. And if I remember correctly, Holger is described as kind of being an older gentleman. Like he's not geriatric or anything, but he's getting on in years. There's probably a little bit of gray in his beard, you could say. And so it just felt really uncomfortable in the scenes where he's hitting on her and getting a little too handsy. And it's like, dude, knock it off. You're the hero. There's also a lot of ye olde English. And what I mean by that is the denizens of the Middle Land. That's what it's called, the Middle Land. I know it's not very original. I guess that's something else I didn't really appreciate about this story. But the denizens of Middle Land speak this kind of conglomeration of Old English and archaic French that luckily Holger is able to speak, so he can communicate with them pretty well. But the way that Poul Anderson transcribes this in the dialogue is through this very old-timey kind of English, this very King James Bible, Shakespearean kind of English. I'll give you the best example I can. The word forsooth is used unironically in this story. Forsooth. Do with that what you will. I personally appreciate when the prose and the dialogue of a story is a little more archaic, especially when it's a medieval fantasy. So it gives it that kind of old-timey feel. I appreciate that. But I know a lot of other readers will be turned off by it, so that's why I'm listing it under the bad. There's also one section near the beginning of the book, it's like only a couple pages in, where we get this massive info dump. Holger, after he arrives in the Middle Land, comes across this old witch, and she basically gives him the full-on backstory of everything that's happened before he arrives. It's just paragraphs and paragraphs of exposition. And luckily, after that, the pacing of the story just takes off, just like a shot put to the end of the book. But those first couple pages are just walls and walls of exposition. And so if you don't stick with it, you'll probably put the book down and you'll probably think it's this really long, meandering, exposition-heavy story. And it's not. It's just those first couple pages. But really, that's all I could complain about. All right, so I've talked about the good. I've talked about the bad. Let's talk about the Gygaxian. What elements of this story had their influence on D&D and fantasy role-playing? Well, let's start with the big one. It's the sort of everything in the kitchen sink approach to fantasy world building that Poul Anderson takes in the book. Much like Middle Land in Three Hearts and Three Lions, Dungeons and Dragons is this expansive, very thematically inclusive game where you have all these different elements of fantasy and mythology and history so that players can come up with really any kind of story they want. I do believe that's by design, mechanically. You can make any kind of fantasy story you want in D&D. When you're running a campaign, you can have any style of fantasy, from high magic to low magic to sword and sorcery, epic fantasy, grimdark, cozy fantasy. Really anything you want. And so when D&D was first in development, when Gary Gygax was first coming up with those rules, I have no doubt that he was thinking to himself, I want players to have as much creative freedom as they want, so I want there to be as many of these fantasy elements as possible. And you know what? If it worked for Poul Anderson, it works for my game, so I might as well make it that way. The other big one is the alignment system, law and chaos. Now, I think we could easily attribute this to Michael Moorcock's Eternal Champion series, which is also included in Appendix N. But seeing as Poul Anderson wrote Three Hearts and Three Lions a little bit before Moorcock started introducing those elements in his stories, we'll go with Poul Anderson for now. Interestingly enough, in the basic rules for the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons, you could only have characters who were aligned to law, chaos, or neutrality. It wasn't until you got into the advanced D&D rule set did you have the classic 9-square alignment chart, where law and chaos was one axis, and good and evil was another axis. So it made 9 different factions that you could align your characters to, so you could have, sort of more complex character building, so that your characters weren't very black and white. And speaking about law versus chaos, it's generally accepted that Holger Karlsson was the inspiration to a very beloved D&D character class, the Paladin.
What's a Paladin?
Shut up. Now, if you've played modern editions of D&D, you know that there's all kinds of different paladins. You can straight up play an evil paladin, or a chaotic paladin, or an oathbreaker paladin. But back when the character class was first introduced through the Greyhawk campaign setting in 1975, paladins could only be aligned to lawful good. That was the only alignment available to them. If they chose not to be lawful good, if they went against their ethics and their oaths, they lost all their powers, and they basically became a worse version of the fighter class. Seeing as the lofty goals and ideals and standards that Holger Karlsson struggles to achieve throughout the course of Three Hearts and Three Lions could be described as lawful good, I think it is safe to say that Holger is the inspiration for the archetypical D&D paladin.
What's a paladin?
Dude, get out of here! Lastly, anyone who's flipped through a D&D monster manual will recognize quite a few of the enemies that Holger and his friends encounter on their journeys. As one example, Holger at one point fights a suit of animated armor that could possibly be the inspiration for the Helmed Horror, but the most notable one is, well, you know how in most fantasy settings, trolls are depicted as these big, muscular, hulking, lumbering oafs with really low IQs who carry around these giant, crude weapons. But in D&D, they're sort of like these hunchbacked, scaly, green, skinny, pot-bellied creatures with these long, drippy noses, and for some reason they have Wolverine's healing factor from X-Men, and they can regrow appendages or pop their heads back onto their necks if they get chopped off. Well, that's because Gary Gygax just straight up stole the trolls from Three Hearts and Three Lions. As far as I am aware, there's not really any other source material out there, like any legends or whatsoever, where trolls can naturally regrow limbs and such. I'm pretty sure it's something totally original that Poul Anderson came up with. And there's this really creepy scene towards the end of the book where Holger and his friends go down into this deep, dark cavern and they encounter this troll. And no matter how hard they hit this thing, no matter how much damage they deal to it, it just keeps coming after them. It keeps following them. It keeps getting back up and putting itself together. It's this really, really harrowing scene. So if you've ever wondered why trolls are so annoying to fight in D&D, blame Poul Anderson. But yeah, that is Three Hearts and Three Lions by Poul Anderson. Guys, thank you so much for joining me on this first episode of Appendix N Adventures. Please let me know what you think, and also let me know in the comments if you've ever read Three Hearts and Three Lions, what you think of it. And as always, farewell, and keep reading.
And check out Sand and Steel, available now on Amazon.com and SecretFireBooks.com. It's short, it's pulpy, and it's bloody as HE double hockey sticks. Reject modernity. Embrace sword and sorcery. Get your copy today.
What's a paladin?